afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this event. My name is Anat Admati, and I am the faculty director of CASI, the Corporation Society Initiative, which is sponsoring this event. We now have a sort of a sister program in the Center for Democracy Development and the Rule of Law called Capitalism and Democracy. And both of those are intended to look at the interaction of business and governments and other institutions of society to see how we can make the market system work, as well as a system of rules and accountability and such. Today we're very happy to have Peter Goodman here. He's a global economic correspondent of the New York Times. Somehow there's a lot of New York Times this year, but we did host Wall Street Journal and ProPublica and other people over the years. And among other things, they'll talk about this book, Davos Man, which we were going to have a bunch of copies as we tried to have, but somehow that didn't work out. But we will take lists and give to people who are here. So I'm really sorry about that, and we'll try to see if we can get Peter's signature on them. But anyway, Rachel, our moderator, so just to say, CASI is a collaboration of faculty, staff, and students. And student leaders are what makes this tick. And we are in transition now to a new and wonderful group. Kate here is among the new leaders, and our outgoing leaders who are going to graduate this year some of them are here, and one of them is moderating. In fact, 3 of them are moderating the 3 events we have this quarter, of which this is the second. Rachel is going to show you some pictures to get you into the atmosphere of Davos in a minute, and I went there myself, so I was very, very excited when I met Peter, and he handed me this book right here about Davos. So I kind of understood a little bit about it. It's a place where somebody, I won't mention the name, said to me, is a place of very self-important people. And so I watched it anthropologically for 2 years. I didn't particularly have a desire to go back there, but I discovered in Peter's book a lot of useful information about the World Economic Forum, that is the nonprofit that sponsors it, and a little more about how it actually works. So in general, in CASI, we try to look at sausage making of all institutions and how things come about and what they mean and who's behind them and all of that. And I think that today's conversation is going to help us with that. Rachel is going to engage with Peter in a conversation, and thank you all for coming, those on the Zoom as well, which Kate is moderating. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anat, for that great introduction. Thank you all to everyone for being here today. I'm excited to have a great conversation with Peter, who's not just another New York Times journalist, but the author of Davos Man, and the wealth of knowledge that we're going to talk about today as it relates to billionaires and global power. I just want to give you some of the highlights of Peter's career, who we're fortunate to have with us. He's been at the New York Times since 2007, where he began by playing a leading role in the coverage of the great financial crisis, which we hear about a lot in business school. He was the paper's European economic correspondent, covering economic news from London from 2016 to 2020, which included Brexit and the COVID pandemic. And he's reported from more than 36 countries, including Iraq, Cambodia, Sudan, South Africa. So MBAs, if you really want to keep traveling, just become a journalist. His book, which we'll discuss today, Davos Man, was published in 2022, and in June, his second book, How the World Ran Out of Everything, is coming out, and we'll cover the global supply chain crisis that ensued after COVID, so we'll get into that a bit today as well. And he's a graduate of Reed College and holds an MA from UC Berkeley in Asian Studies. So thank you so much for being here today, Peter. As not mentioned, I want to start by demystifying Davos a bit, which, for those of you that aren't aware, it's also the World Economic Forum, which we hear a lot about. So I've pulled together a few shots of the event, and then I'm hoping, Peter, you can help us understand what it was like for you to visit Davos. So this is Davos, beautiful, beautiful little town that thousands of people descend upon every January to host the World Economic Forum. Looks like a normal meeting where billionaires gather. It's led by Klaus Schwab, who started the event more than 40-something years ago. It's also the home of a lot of private jets. And depending on what color badge you're wearing, it will dictate what rooms you are allowed to go into. So, Peter, you must have had an orange badge here.
No, actually, I never had an orange badge. I always had a white badge and always lorded it over other people. No, whatever badge you have, you feel that you don't have the right badge, and you stare at those hologram badges and wonder what secret places they allow people to get into.
If you have the right badge, they drive you around. Otherwise, you take the shuttle.
You got driven around, obviously.
No. Oh. I was part of the entertainment. The academics are the entertainment. And they have fewer of them are here today.
Yeah, so tell us about Davos. How did it start? What is it? How did you end up getting there to cover it?
Well, that could occupy many hours by itself. What is Davos? Davos started as a basic idea from Klaus Schwab, who's this German economist, that it would be a good idea to get the public sector and the private sector together in one place and talk about the world's problems. And that happened back in the 1970s, and it started with a few hundred people. And it was kind of this unimpeachable idea that if you could get government and business together, you could at least map out potential solutions to problems. And he decided to have it in this former sanitarium, this kind of oddly charmless village. The Alps themselves are, of course, quite spectacular. It's a wonderful place to ski if you want to do that. That's what most people do in Davos for the 51 weeks of the year that it isn't full of billionaires. And then over the years, he grew it into something that, while it continued to be a nonprofit on paper, functioned like a wildly successful business in every other way. It's now, about 3,000 people show up, lots of CEOs, finance companies, tech companies, heads of state. There's always a celebrity or two. Matt Damon once had dinner with Peter Gabriel, who told me about how he was making music with chimpanzees. That was kind of interesting. There's always like something like that going on. And then there are a lot of very well-intentioned non-governmental organization people, a lot of academics, a lot of very brilliant academics who can tell you all sorts of things about all sorts of things you didn't even know that you didn't know about. But what it really became is this gathering place beyond the purview of regulators, journalists, in one concentrated spot where the world's wealthiest, most powerful people can transact. And we can get into this later. There are lots of crazy conspiracy theories about Davos. People like, Steve Bannon love to talk about it like it's some sort of, deep state secret government. That part's just all artifice. Davos, the World Economic Forum has no real power other than as a convener of powerful people. And when you talk to the business executives who go there and they speak candidly, they'll tell you the point of this is that they normally have to fly around the globe over many months to meet the number of people they can interact with, again, in a quiet space with no regulators, no journalists, no disclosure, over the course of 4 or 5 days. They can do a year's worth of business. And so it's not that the forum is this like magical institution or that Davos is this magical place. It just happens to be the place where all these people meet. They could meet anywhere and do pretty much the same stuff that they do there. They do deals with one another. They serve their interests. So you asked, how did I end up there? Well, I actually had a brief hiatus from the New York Times. I worked for Arianna Huffington for a couple years and ran original reporting at the HuffPost at a time when she was trying to sell what had been a successful blog to a media company. And I was like the hood ornament on her operation. She sort of made me an offer that I couldn't refuse. And she said, you have to come to Davos so I can show everyone that we have this legitimate journalist at the Huffington Post. And I went off and was sort of fascinated and horrified by what I saw there. I've been at Davos and seen billionaires literally indulge, I'm not making this up, in a simulation of the Syrian refugee experience where they submit to being blindfolded and they're led around in the dark while someone's hollering at them for their papers in Arabic. And then, the lights come back on, and then they're congratulated for their virtue signaling, handed a glass of champagne, and sent off to some banquet, funded by McKinsey or HSBC or Google. I've seen pharma CEOs start their mornings in meditation sessions led by John Kabat-Zinn before they go off to their private suites to talk about the latest deal engineered to make drugs completely unaffordable for most people. You see this stuff, and it's hard not to shake the sense that it's really important. It's really kind of horrifying. And as I learned reluctantly, because I did go back for years, I went back 2 other times with HuffPost. I became the editor-in-chief of something called the International Business Times, and I went back as it was a good brand building exercise. And when I went back to the Times in 2016 and went to London, by then I had kind of come to the conclusion that it was journalistically useful if you were willing to break the kind of unwritten decorum of the place and ask people the sorts of pushy questions that journalists ought to ask. There were a lot of powerful people wandering around who knew all sorts of things. So I kept going, and that seems like an adequate answer to your question.
Yeah. So, Davos is organized by the World Economic Forum. It's this one event that's happening in January. It also seems to be kind of this pinnacle of globalization. Everyone has come together. We brought everyone here. I can chat with both the Chinese leaders and the Indonesian leaders. What's also happening with World Economic Forum outside of the January gathering? How has this continued to grow and become what it is today?
Yeah, so Klaus Schwab turned it into this wildly successful business where these member companies, it's mostly companies that pay the big money, will pay hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for membership. Then they pay, the last I checked, somewhere around $27,000 per person to go and attend the forum itself. But then the forum has regional meetings in places like Riyadh, Tianjin, China, sometimes in Qingdao. There's one in Latin America. They pop up around the globe. And then there actually are a lot of brilliant scholars who are attached to the forum who do a lot of really important research. There's a lot of good data on their website. And it functions much like other kind of globally interested think tanks. What I argue in the book is that most of this is largely irrelevant to the business proposition that Schwab has advanced for himself. While it is a nonprofit on paper, he pays himself several $100,000 a year. He's had the forum buy land that makes contiguous his residence. It's a lakefront mansion in Geneva, next to the forum headquarters. He can walk back and forth between the two. Audi is the official sponsor of the forum, and he always seems to be driving an Audi. He gets flown around by Swiss Air at the front of the plane. He lives like a very, very comfortable person. And the forum activities themselves, which are these sort of perfectly earnest, often interesting discussions of all sorts of issues that are really important, that are issues that I'm sure lots of us in this room care about: the future of corporate governance, financial regulation, climate change, gender and racial balance in companies, conflict resolutions. There are all these earnest seminars, but the cool kids at Davos, the wealthiest people who are actually paying to go to the meetings, will actually tell you openly as a badge of honor, I never set foot inside the Congress Center in the 4 or 5 days I was there. I didn't go to a single panel. I went to the Google party. I went to the Salesforce party. And here's my selfie with Mark Benioff while the Black Eyed Peas are up on stage, who he flew in, personally for the performance. And really what I did was I sat in my private suite at the Belvedere Hotel, which is off of the official site for the forum, or I got access to the private lounges inside the Congress Center itself, where Klaus Schwab loves to play matchmaker, and the head of a fossil fuel company can sit opposite a member of the Saudi royal family in a windowless space. Again, no disclosure, and they can do what they do. That's what the forum's really about. That's why these companies are paying huge amounts of money for access.
Yeah. So it sounds like, there's obviously an incredible infrastructure that's been put in place, but you're highlighting about the people themselves that are actually there. And so the premise of your book is Davos Man, which you describe as, a person and like an entity of people that are billionaires, have a ton of global influence and power. And in your book, you go through some examples of who these people, you've mentioned Benioff, some of the others, Schwartzman. What is the Davos Man, and how did you land on that term, and how does it come out of the forum?
I stole that term from Samuel Huntington, who coined it in 2004 to describe, as he put it, a tribe of people who are so powerful and operate across jurisdictions that they don't have any particular loyalty to any state. I'm not really hung up on the kind of national implication of that. I'm interested in using Davos Man as in a slightly different way than Huntington did. I'm interested in how the billionaire class, I think in contrast to, say, the robber barons of previous centuries, they're not content to simply have most of the money and live at a standard that most of us can't even imagine. They would ask us to believe that they are the good guys in the narrative, so that we can trust them to solve our problems. And so their narrative, and really the narrative of the World Economic Forum, is an elaborate justification for the status quo. It's like, it's a story that says you don't have to use democracy. Democracy is almost irrelevant. You don't need to regulate us. You don't need to tax us. In fact, if you tax us, you're wasting capital that, you're squandering money that could go into our philanthropic enterprises where we can do so much more good. Never mind that the data consistently shows that billionaires who talk about their philanthropic enterprises kick in a fraction of what they actually put in, and like a fraction of what we would collect through a wealth tax or even just old-fashioned progressive taxation like we used to have before some very well-paid accountants and consultants, figured out how to help Davos Man avoid the tax bill. You don't have to regulate us. You don't have to tax us. You don't have to worry about antitrust law. Just let us meet together and we will solve your problems. We will take care of systematic discrimination. We will take care of climate change. We will solve the problems of urban reality. We will take care of education and healthcare. All of these things that we all care about that traditionally we would think we would have a say over through the exercise of democracy. You don't have to do any of those things because we're here, and by dint of the fact that we're showing up at places like Davos, and the mantra of the World Economic Forum is committed to improving the state of the world. I mean, the idea that the world's most powerful, wealthy people are going to show up at this little place in Switzerland, these are the ultimate beneficiaries of the status quo, and actually be invested in changing the status quo to make things better for the rest of us is, on its face, laughable. And I don't think they really expect that all of us will believe it and buy it. Maybe on some level they do, because CEOs of finance and tech companies are largely salespeople. I mean, they're about manufacturing narratives. But they convince themselves of this. And so what I came to conclude from doing this book and from going to Davos 9 or 10 times, I lost track, is that it's really like a rallying cry for the tribe of Davos men themselves. Like, they go there, they demonstrate their goodness by being there, and then they go home, and it's like they're armored for the real work of continuing to seek out the next way to deregulate and cut taxes for themselves, because the fewer regulations, the fewer taxes they have to pay, like the more good they can do.
Yeah, so it sounds like good intent and lots of money does not necessarily equal good solutions.
I mean, look, we've lived through an open air experiment of this since the 1980s. Like, how's it worked out for everybody? I mean, we're living in what is, on paper, the richest, most powerful country on earth, and we didn't have PPE in the middle of a public health crisis that, killed 1 million people. that wasn't really very good. But yeah, let's get real. I mean, our infrastructure is crumbling. Education is unaffordable for lots of people. Housing is unaffordable for lots of people. We've got tens of millions of people who maybe they have some kind of health care, but it's not good enough to really count on. People can't move to the places they might be able to move to for better jobs because they're worried about giving up whatever they've got, because we understand that if you lose your job, certainly in this society, you could end up homeless. I mean, that's extreme, but that's a story that's unfortunately all around us. We have lived in this open air experiment of this idea that if we organize society around the interests of the wealthiest people and allow them to do what they do, which is amass wealth, use their wealth to influence the political system, and then use the political system to make it easier for them to amass more wealth, that doesn't work out very well. And what we've also learned is that eventually we have huge numbers of people who are very angry and who conclude, not without reason, that the elites don't care about their needs much, and are then become targets for political opportunists to sell all sorts of crackpot ideas, demonizing outsiders, immigrants, and while prescribing often solutions that make real economic problems worse. And that, unfortunately, is not just an American story. I mean, my book we can get into this if you like, or read it. Brexit, the rise of the far right in France, even Sweden, Italy. I think the rise of populism in places like India and the Philippines is reflective of this same force of economic inequality. And the ultimate point of my book is that that's not an accident. None of this stuff happened by accident. It's not a conspiracy. It's happened because of things that we can see right out in the open, with the billionaire class using its power to manipulate our tax code, to manipulate the legal system, and to make sure that they're in a position to amass more wealth more easily.
Yeah, I'm curious when you think about, we have this like American dream, and I'm going to work really hard, and I'm going to create something new and become a billionaire. Where does this start to go wrong? Is it chasing shareholder returns at all costs? Is it that stakeholder capitalism isn't really the solution it's supposed to be? Like, how do we create wealth in a way that can actually be funneled to good?
Let's pick off stakeholder capitalism, which is a phrase that we hear less and less of, along with ESG, because people like Larry Fink, the world's largest asset manager, who's another character in my book, have stopped using it because there's been a backlash from the fossil fuel industry. I mean, the state of Texas is pulling their pension funds out of BlackRock because they're unhappy about how Larry Fink was talking too much about climate change. Stakeholder capitalism, when I started writing this book, was much in vogue. I mean, in the summer of 2019, the Business Roundtable collection of CEOs in Washington came out with their statement of a purpose of a corporation, this kind of updated statement of what a corporation is supposed to be. They said, essentially, the old days of shareholder maximization, Milton Friedman, the libertarian idea that if we just let markets do what markets will do, the social good will be maximized for all. That's no longer true. We take note of the backlash to that, and now we embrace stakeholder capitalism, the notion that it's not just about shareholders, there are other stakeholders, local communities, workers, the environment. Mark Benioff once went on Jim Cramer's Mad Men show and said, the planet is a stakeholder, Jim, which is very good news for those of us who live on the planet, but I think also gives away the ridiculous notion that, if everything's a stakeholder, then nothing's a stakeholder, right? So they come out with this idea in 2019. Davos, the following year, runs the whole World Economic Forum on stakeholder capitalism. And then what happens? The pandemic. How does stakeholder capitalism work out in the pandemic? Well, Jeff Bezos was one of the signatories of the Business Roundtable statement. It was 181 CEOs, I think, signed it. Jeff Bezos leaves his warehouse workers laboring with no PPE in the midst of the pandemic, even as people are getting sick in warehouses. When they say, hey, it would be nice to have PPE, he says, well, unfortunately, there's so much demand that we don't have any, we can't find any. And they say, well, that's very interesting because we're actually putting it in boxes for the people who are willing to pay for it. Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, signs the Stakeholder Capitalism Pledge. And thank you, Pfizer, for taking publicly financed research behind vaccines and delivering these miraculous mRNA vaccines faster than most people thought possible. We, all of us in this country, in this room, are fortunate to have had access to that technology. Unfortunately, Albert Bourla makes all of these statements about how he's going to participate in COVAX, stakeholder capitalism on steroids, this nonprofit that's going to distribute vaccines around the world. Well, Pfizer gives basically nothing to COVAX, and a year later, while we're all going back to living our lives thanks to vaccines, people in places like Pakistan, Ghana, doctors are going in to attend to patients stricken with COVID with no vaccine, because the moral of the story is people who are able to pay the freight for the monopoly profits of Pfizer get vaccine, and everybody else gets free enterprise. I'd call it what you will. We could go on and on about how the Stakeholder Capitalism Pledge worked out, but there was actually some research done by some people at MIT who figured out that there was no difference on a bunch of social measures between how companies that signed the Stakeholder Capitalism Pledge conducted their business during the pandemic and those that didn't sign it. And in fact, the ones that didn't sign it did slightly better. And the most incredible thing was that of the signatories of the Stakeholder Capitalism Pledge, only one of them bothered to get board approval to change their mission statements, which kind of tells you that it was a public relations exercise. So what do we do about all of that? I don't think shareholder maximization is a bad thing from the standpoint of running a company. And I don't think the fact that there are people who are wildly rich because they had good ideas and managed to get other people to invest in their ideas and build businesses that develop services and built manufactured goods that people actually want. I don't think it's bad that people got rich through that enterprise. I just don't think that we should delude ourselves, and it's not us doing the deluding, let's be clear, it's the group I call Davos Man, that those people, the people who won, can then be trusted to fix all of our problems. The market is a great way to encourage the sort of innovation that will allow companies to bring things like mRNA vaccines into creation when we need them. The market can play a role there, but government has to play a role in terms of the distribution of the goods themselves, the distribution of those gains, because there are lots of public goods, to state what I think is kind of the obvious, that nobody directly pays for unless there's taxation, right? Like, we're not going to have great education, we're not going to have highways, we're not going to have somebody worrying about planes not crashing in the air or giant container ships taking out bridges in major cities. Like, unless we've got somebody watching how this whole thing goes, we need rules for the market to do its work in a way that's consistent with public goods. So I don't think there's anything wrong with business and people pursuing profits through business. I just think we have to get back to also exercising democracy so that the public gets some say about how this whole thing goes.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to hear a bit more about some of the stories in the book, and maybe starting with what was the process like for you to actually write this book? So you've obviously, of course, went to Davos many times, but there's some very powerful stories in here about healthcare, what happened during COVID, housing crisis. How did you decide to focus on these particular topics, and what was that process like for you to dive in?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Originally it was really a book about the origins of right-wing populism. So I'm living in the UK, and I'm coming to understand that Britain's decision to leave the European Union is really a backlash to inequality. That gets expressed as, we're going to take back control. We're going to stop immigrants from overrunning our borders. And never mind that immigrants actually do most of the work, as I think they probably do in most of the wealthy world. And it turns out not to have been such a great idea to tell the people who are building buildings and driving trucks around to stop coming. But I'm trying to understand, how this has occurred. and it goes back to the great financial crisis and banks getting bailed out, bankers getting bailed out, at the same time that George Osborne, who's a big character in my book, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who then goes on to run a very successful life in finance, but as he comes in as the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 2010, imposes really draconian austerity on Britain, slashes social services. People are really hurting, and it's a longer, more complicated story than this, but basically this crystallizes in this Brexit vote, this way to kind of just stick it to the elites. At the same time that we're experiencing something similar in this country in terms of Trump and Trumpism, and I'm writing stories about the yellow vests in France, who are a complex story, but there's a simple sort of backlash component. Macron comes into office and slashes wealth taxes and then sticks all ordinary people with a gas tax, and people are outraged. And at the same time, I'm trying to understand how Italy and Sweden are lurching to the extreme right, with the commonality being this demonization of immigrants as a useful political story for opportunists. And I thought, well, a way in is a scene that I saw at the World Economic Forum in January 2017. It's like a few days before Trump's going to be inaugurated. And the World Economic Forum that year is full of conversations about inequality and populism. And so I did this story for the Times where I walked around Davos, just kind of asking people very open-endedly, okay, you're worried about populism, you're a little spooked by Brexit and Trump talking about, blowing up the dollar and blowing up NATO, and we're going to have a trade war. What are you personally willing to give up to deal with inequality? And I got this sampling of answers to the question that ranged from I heard Ray Dalio, the hedge fund guy, who at that point was worth like $18 billion on paper. Well, we need more deregulation to really unleash the animal spirits of the market, and that will take care of inequality. I heard the head of Infosys, this big consulting company, say, workers need to take control of their own futures by training themselves for the future jobs. My former boss, Arianna Huffington, basically said everyone needs more comfortable pillows and trips to Canyon Ranch Spa, and then we'll all be less stressed and the world will be better. I heard everything except for, well, some of the people who are here in Davos, we have to give up some of our gains so that we can have, infrastructure and education and affordable housing and things that polls show everyone actually wants. And that was like no go. And at one point, actually, Christine Lagarde at some panel, suggested that and then was, shushed basically by the moderator, and the discussion went on. So I thought, well, this is the way into this book about the roots of populism. And then I thought, well, I can't just use Davos Man as this composite. I got to put meat to the bone. I realized I could have written it about 50 different Davos men, but I picked the people who I was sort of most familiar with or who struck me. I'd always been struck by how Benioff operated at Davos and was really seen as like the good guy, and in many ways is a good guy, and it was a complicated character because he actually does real philanthropy. He's taken heroic stands on social issues. He threatened to shut down Salesforce operations in Indiana when they passed this very discriminatory anti-LGBTQ law. He's written, very large checks. It's not just like Steve Schwarzman putting his name on buildings. And yet Salesforce, just coincidentally, has somehow managed to twice pay the modest sum of $0 on its federal taxes, which makes, all the other stuff like his financing of this initiative to tax San Francisco tech companies to pay for housing for homeless people, all that's like a rounding error against that. So then I developed it into this look at these 5 key characters as a way in.
And through these characters and the countries that you mentioned, you also get into some stories about specific sectors of the market. So you get into housing, for example, and how it's been decimated by some of the entrance of private equity funds, and healthcare. I'm curious if you talk a bit about some of the stories you heard there from people.
Sure. Yeah, like one story that really struck me was I was looking at Steve Schwarzman, Blackstone, of course, world's largest private equity company, and how Schwarzman had found his way into healthcare. And before the pandemic, was buying up vast swaths of American healthcare. And I ran into a doctor by the name of Ming Lin, who was an ER doc at a hospital in Bellingham, Washington. And this is north of Seattle. And Ming Lin had been an ER doc in New York, actually, during 9/11, had been in an emergency room, like very close to the World Trade Center. I mean, this was like a seasoned ER doc who was working at this hospital when Blackstone purchased a company called Team Health. Team Health is one of the two largest staffing companies for American emergency rooms. Roughly 1 out of every 3 doctors you might encounter in an emergency room in the United States is employed either by Team Health or this other company called, I think it's M-Vision, which is owned by KKR. And Ming Lin had seen up close that like Blackstone comes in through Team Health and suddenly there are all these like metrics that force doctors to move faster, spend less time with patients, do things that will lead to more revenue. They're actually assessed, formally assessed on the basis of how much revenue they earn per encounter with patients. And there's like a scoreboard that's publicly accessible so they can all see who the slackers are, you know, in terms of making money for the company. So the pandemic happens. Ming Lin's wife's parents are from Taiwan, so he's like clued in early to the pandemic. And Taiwan handled the first wave of the pandemic really well, and he's really attuned to it. And the state of Washington gets its first COVID patient. The governor declares state of emergency. Meanwhile, at his hospital, there's like nobody wearing masks at the front desk. He suggests to the hospital administrators, maybe we should have like a triage system, like we could at least greet people outside before we can figure this out. And he's basically told again and again, like, no, we can't do any of these things. We don't want to freak out the patients with somebody wearing a mask because we got people coming in for elective procedures, you know, plastic surgery. We don't want to freak these people out. So business as usual. And eventually he's just so upset by this that he goes on Facebook. He hadn't been much of a Facebook user. And he starts, you know, letting the world know what's going on at this hospital. Well, it's a longer story in the book, but the short version is they fired him. And they fired the whistleblower. And the fact that this company, Blackstone, that would have us believe is the solution to the healthcare crisis, you know, efficiency, greater market force, is going to, you know, allow us to more efficiently allocate healthcare resources. When in fact, you know, we now know that the story of companies like Blackstone entering American healthcare is to cut capacity because they view healthcare in the same way that publicly traded companies view any industry. You know, your airline wants those seats full. So if they have to limit service to create some anxiety that you might not get a seat on the plane, so you'll pay a higher fare, that's what they'll do. Well, we know now that in the decade before the pandemic, we took essentially 1/3 of the hospital rooms offline in the United States. We know that consultants like McKinsey, you know, unsuccessfully told the German government that they should, you know, order fewer ventilators. We know that in Italy, this is a story I get into in the book, in northern Italy, in Lombardy, one of the wealthiest regions of Europe, there was a privatization scheme that involved shutting down capacity. It's about pricing power for profitable healthcare. And it's a very good way to get advances in sophisticated industries, you know, cardiac surgery, novel ways to treat cancer. It's a very good way to get people at the table who have an incentive to develop therapies. But if you want to do basic medicine, it's not a good way to go. And of course, Blackstone's company, Team Health, has been at the center of this surprise billing scandal. The surprise is not of the happy variety. This is the surprise that you've gone to a hospital that you think is in your healthcare net. It is in your healthcare network. So you think you're going to be charged some reasonable rate, pay whatever the copay is, the deductible. And in fact, the second you get there, you sign paperwork that has said, yes, I agree to be treated by someone outside of network, and then you get some outrageous bill, and people get harassed by bill collectors for the rest of their lives. And of course, Schwartzman understands what casino operators understand. Like if you get people drunk and stick them in windowless places where you don't know what time it is, that's a good way to keep them at the table. Maybe they won't make the best, most sensible decisions. Well, if you hand people a clipboard when they're being wheeled in on a gurney and they're only somewhat conscious, that's a very good way to get them to sign off to essentially be fleeced. And the book gets into greater detail, but Schwartzman has not only engaged in that through Team Health, but has then managed to put off regulation by positing his own company, Team Health, as the antidote to the rapacious, health insurance lobby. That's the real bad guy in this story, in which there are unfortunately no good guys, but there are a lot of victims.
That's super hard to listen to and read in the book, and these stories are continuing today. You've written another book now about the supply chain crisis. You said some of the stuff kind of overlaps a bit, but one of the stories you get into is about beef workers during the pandemic and slaughterhouse workers that are slaughtering beef, and that's just one example of kind of these supply chain decisions that we started to make. I'm curious if you can talk about those themes that are coming up in your new book.
Yeah, appreciate that. So the new book's called How the World Ran Out of Everything Inside the Global Supply Chain. And I started writing it in the middle of the pandemic when we were experiencing all of these shortages. And it grapples with, it follows a shipping container from a factory in Ningbo, China, to a warehouse in Starkville, Mississippi, and looks at what happens to it along the way. It looks at this international shipping cartel that's responsible for the container shipping industry, the so-called truck driver shortage, which is really about downgrading truck driving to a point at which, if you're thinking about being a truck driver, think again. Same with warehouse workers, but it also looks, and this does dovetail with Davos Man, it also looks at the impact of monopoly power. And I do look at the beef industry where we now have market consolidation that is beyond what we had at the height of the robber barons. We have 4 companies in the United States that control roughly 85% of the supply for beef. And what I didn't know, I get into this a little bit in Davos Man, but what I didn't know and have fleshed out in the new book is that there was such an attempt to limit the supply of beef and at the same time keep that supply being produced while generating, this is a complicated story that I'm now telling badly, there was a manipulation of the purchasing of cattle themselves such that the 4 giant companies that dominate the supply had a buyer's market and could buy the animals at a very tight supply, while at the same time arguing that it was difficult to operate because of the COVID pandemic, which constrained the supply of processed beef coming out the other end, which allowed them to charge distributors and ultimately us consumers more than they ever had before. So you had a situation where $1 of revenue from beef was 67 cents on the dollar went to the 4 giant companies that dominated the supply, and only 32 cents went to ranchers. So you had ranchers going out of business. At the same time, you had slaughterhouse workers who were labeled essential workers. The Trump administration issued an executive order that said slaughterhouse workers are essential workers. They've got to continue to show up, even though they had no PPE, we had no tests, people are getting sick. Several hundred people at the one plant that I focused on in Greeley, Colorado, got sick in the first couple of weeks, and dozens of people died. And yet what I didn't know when I wrote that book was that the largest meat processors were actually sitting on record inventories in their freezers that they were shipping to China and other overseas markets. So we had the Trump administration say publicly, if these people don't continue to show up and do their jobs in these dangerous conditions, we will not have meat. The American people will be hungry. At the same time that what we're really doing is jacking up the retail price of the good through this kind of manipulated scarcity while they're actually exporting and cashing in on increased global prices. So monopoly power is a major part of the Future book, and it's one of the well-honed strategies that Davos Man has got to keep the profits flowing.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience, so get your questions ready. We obviously, as a bunch of business school students and faculty, some of us have worked for billionaires, may work for billionaires, maybe we want to become a billionaire.
Sure, good luck.
What would be, I guess, what would be your advice to us?
How to be a billionaire?
No, what would be the advice
my wife
about
says
how
my book
to?
would have sold a lot better if it had been pitched that way. Yeah.
What would be your advice to us that want to continue to ask the hard questions, and what should our role be in trying to look out for Davos Man and how it may influence our lives?
That's a tricky question to answer because, again, like my goal here is just to say we can't trust these people to solve our problems. It's not that they're bad. Like probably most of you, like I'm delighted that I have Google. I found ChatGPT to be pretty useful. I'm a big fan of technology. And I love innovation, and I'm pro-business. Like I like hanging out with entrepreneurs and hearing their ideas. So keep your eyes open, stay true to your own values, and don't drink this Kool-Aid that if you go into business and engage in ideally producing things that people need and want, that's the same as progressive taxation, antitrust enforcement, again, the government playing some role in determining whether the rules are fair. Like, have at it, have fun, get rich, enjoy your wealth, but don't internalize this absurd message that this makes you inherently good and you gave at the office. Like, you still have to pay your taxes so that the next generation of people can get education and drive around and make use of public goods like the internet to create their own businesses.
Great advice. Thank you. All right,
I don't know if that'll actually help anybody, but I hope that's what happens.
Let's go to the audience if you have some questions.
Hi, Peter. Appreciate you being here today and sharing some pretty alarming stories. My question is, you talked about if we can't trust the business elite who are characterized by this Davos man, and that we need to look to government and regulation to maybe correct out market inefficiency and look out for the little people. How should we feel then? One of the pictures that was flashed is Bill Clinton up on stage, or like there are 300 world leaders that are in attendance at this conference. How should we feel about them, being a part of that, if you even think that they're a part of that? And then how should we look to government in the future to maybe, how should they operate?
That's a great question. I think we should feel concerned. I think, not to pick on Bill Clinton, although I do, in both in this book and in the book to come, I think Clinton is a classic regulatory capture example. Clinton really is a Davos man. Clinton is a brilliant, thoughtful person who I think probably went into public service initially for all sorts of good reasons, who along the way convinced himself that the more power he's got, the more good he can do, and the more money he can raise, the more power he'll have, and got more and more comfortable with the sorts of compromises that I think would make the rest of us blush. I think it's fair to say that without Bill Clinton and his continuation of deregulation wave that happened initially, people like to say Reagan, but it's really Carter. And the next book really gets deep into Carter in terms of things like the transportation networks and deregulation. But Reagan was the high water mark of deregulation for a while. But Clinton continued it. Clinton continued the absolute defenestration of antitrust, which is something that we haven't really talked about yet, and did this in the name of making the American economy very conducive for large businesses, which in and of itself is not a bad thing if that goes along with the sorts of policies that are required so more people can participate in the gains. But then he signs, the welfare reform law, which allows states to impose really draconian limits on welfare. So, we have Bill Clinton to thank for the fact that if you fail in the United States, man, it's a steep, fast way down. And so I think we should be concerned that Bill Clinton likes to hobnob, not only at Davos, there are these famous pictures of him, hanging out with Sam Bankman-Fried in the Bahamas at the great, what was it, the crypto conference right before SBF's downfall. I think it's fair to say, and this was why I personally, as a journalist, was always a little uncomfortable with going to Davos. Like, we do tend to adopt the mindset of the people around us. And if our elected officials and our regulators are mostly hanging out with tech CEOs, finance CEOs, we shouldn't be surprised when they tend to do their bidding. Some of that is direct influence through things like campaign finance, which is really big. But I think a lot of it is just sort of opportunity. Frankly, I see this in my own profession. I mean, there are people who engage in access journalism. They're positioning themselves to get the next, incremental scoop about mergers and acquisitions and corporate announcements, and as a result of that, they spend most of their time not out talking to people whose job descriptions, don't include talking to people like them, but people who do, so they end up parroting, not because they're bad or because they're corrupt, but just because this is how human nature works. They end up parroting the talking points of the interest that they spend time with. So yeah, we should be concerned. We should want them to get out more.
So thank you so much for the talk. Now, isn't that the consequence of what you said, that democracy worked as expected, as a check on the powerful, by electing Trump, by cutting the European Union, because these were institutions, especially the EU, I'm from Spain, that I grew up when the EU was in the 90s, sold as the big thing. And I benefited from the EU. I can't get into the details, but essentially benefited the wealthy that were able to, to lower the cost of doing trade in Europe. But the little guy in Europe actually suffers, especially if you're in sectors like agriculture. And the same is true about the US. You talked about Bill Clinton. His wife is more of the same, and the people said, stop it. So isn't that democracy working as expected? What did we just...
Well, it's certainly democracy.
As a check on the powerful, that's what as a veto power of, you are going too far.
Well, I mean, what has Donald Trump done for the people whose interests he claims to serve in terms of the little guy?
I didn't say that. I didn't say that. I said that the little guy saw that Bill Clinton, his wife, all those people that you are denouncing.
Yeah,
I
agree. If your question is like, are lots of people around the world coming to the conclusion that the system's basically rigged, that the people in power don't spend a lot of time thinking about their interests, their ability to pay their bills, send their kids to college, buy a home, have healthcare, they're absolutely right. And what we've learned is that when you allow generations to go by with large numbers of people legitimately concluding that they don't fit into the designs of the people in power, a lot of stuff can happen and a lot of it's not good. And that is very much where we are now. Most extremely here in this country, but in a lot of other countries as well.
I'm from Geneva, so I grew up very close to the World Economic Forum. I also was involved with the World Economic Forum, and based on my understanding is that this type of guest speakers is not common anymore at Davos. And I know there is also a big succession plan that is missing on Klaus Schwab and who is going to come next. And so my question to you is, do you think that the golden era of Davos is finished, and what would be the alternative now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Schwab is such an egomaniac that he is afraid to delegate. I mean, Schwab, I get into some of these stories in the book if you're interested in this sort of titillating stuff, but he's a really small-minded, extremely vain person who once tried to get somebody fired because they parked in his dedicated parking spot at the forum in Geneva, and like multiple staff people had to get involved to get him to, knock it off. It's okay, it was a mistake, no big deal. He's very hot-tempered. He thinks he should get to travel like a diplomat at all times, and he went through a tantrum in South Africa when he wasn't allowed to use the diplomatic entryway, through immigration. And so as a result, he has not delegated, and he burns through staff. People get really tired of working for him. He's a bully, and there's nobody who's really in a position to take over. And fundamentally, I mean, we haven't talked about this either. I mean, his magic is he gets people to attend who are powerful because they know that lots of other powerful people are attending. And the way he gets people to come is by sort of laundering their ethical problems. And the code is like he never asks anyone an uncomfortable question. So it's total access, right? I watched him, you can watch this for yourself if you're interested on YouTube, bring Trump up to the stage right after the Trump $1.5 trillion package of tax cuts had passed. And he praised him by thanking him for not just being a great leader and economic steward, but being a fount of inclusivity for the American people. He once said, he said to Narendra Modi, it was like a couple months after a member of Modi's BJP party in India put $1 million bounty on the head of a Bollywood director for producing a movie that was supposedly offensive to some important Hindu narrative. He said that Modi was a paragon of diversity and inclusion for India. I mean, this is the Schwab magic. So that'll be very difficult to replicate. Now, certainly the forum seems less and less relevant. I mean, every year that goes by, somebody writes the same sorts of stories about how it's just almost self-parody, but people keep showing up. So if it's not Davos, it'll be some other event because it's clearly useful to have a gathering place of the rich and the powerful in a place they can operate without being regulated. But I don't know. It's an open question.
Hi. Thank you for the pretty revealing perspectives. I'm trying to wonder how we sort of operationalize this in our own lives. Does this mean, and a few thoughts that are in my head, like, does this mean Davos and things like Davos should be banned and rich people and successful business people should not be allowed to meet together? Or are we saying that, hey, all you GSP kids, when you raise a big company, you raise big funds and you become billionaires, if you fly to Davos in your private jet, you're automatically a hypocrite? No, I'm not being negative.
This is a good question.
I'm curious about what the operational perspective on this is and how you look at how we should sort of move forward from here.
Yeah, look, it's a great, again, no, I don't think Davos should be banned. I don't think it should be illegal for rich, powerful people to get together and discuss whatever it is they want to discuss. I just think the rest of us need to be clear that this is not a substitute for us regulating and taxing and having a say about how society functions. And there have to be rules. So if two powerful executives for publicly traded companies want to meet in a room, well, if the United States has jurisdiction, the SEC has some say over what's supposed to be disclosed, what are acceptable terms of engagement. There needs to be disclosure over the money in campaigns. So no, it would be absurd. I mean, I don't want to live in an authoritarian society where people can't meet, and I don't want to live in a society where business is shackled and can't do what business has done. I just think we have to be clear that for something like 30 years after the Second World War till the mid-1970s, we had robust economic growth. We had wage gains. I'm talking just about the United States now. We had wage gains for virtually every segment of the population, and we had serious antitrust enforcement. We had progressive taxation. We had rules that have essentially been dismantled over time by Davos Man manipulating the political system. We need to get back to that. It's not that we need to shackle business. It's not that we need to limit business. We need to put the rules back in the marketplace. And finally, we need to stop falling for this fake narrative that Davos Man is really skilled at, where like we get these false binaries. Like, we can either have the status quo where we have economic inequality, we have homelessness, we have some monopoly power, but we get magnificent things like vaccines and the latest apps and central air conditioning and all sorts of things that we all really like. We can either have that or we can be Venezuela, right? And like that's just absurd, right? Like, and we can look to the Nordic countries as examples of you can have dynamic growth, you can have innovation, you can still have some social protection. There are lots of ways to structure our societies that are different than simply allowing the billionaire class to write the rules with impunity for everyone without, becoming some, hellscape.
Awesome. I think that's a great place for us to end. Thank you so much to Peter
you.
for being here today in this great conversation. Everyone thank him.
Thank you.